Celeste Monroe woke up at 5:42 a.m. on that Monday in September. The alarm sound was unnecessary. She had been awake for nearly 20 minutes, staring at the light filtering through the bedroom blinds. At 48 years old, Celeste had on her face the serenity of someone who learned to move in silence within noisy systems. She had lived alone since her divorce 5 years ago in a simple, elegant apartment in downtown Charleston where every object had a place and each morning began the same way. Black coffee, a quick read of the Post and Courier, and the 8-minute meditation she never skipped, even on court days. That morning, she wore the same grey tailored pants she wore on Mondays, a white button-down blouse and a navy blue blazer. She left her black robe in the back seat of the car, as she always did. I never imagined that, on that day, being without him would make all the difference. Before the story takes an unexpected turn, take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel. We always bring impactful and real stories like this one. You won't want to miss the next ones. As she parked her silver Buick in front of the federal courthouse, Celeste noticed that the side parking lot reserved for judges was closed for maintenance. She left her car on the street, adjusted her leather briefcase, and walked up the stone steps with firm steps, as she had done for almost 2 decades. It was 7:58 a.m. The first rays of sunlight were piercing the branches of the trees with Spanish moss, drawing long shadows on the stairs of the imposing building. At the main entrance, there was already a small line for the X-ray. Celeste, as always, preferred to go through the common entrance, not out of formality but out of habit. She believed that being accessible was also part of the job. She smiled at the receptionist, who didn't recognize her, and waited her turn. It was then that she heard the voice behind her, dry and authoritative. "You, young lady, with no visible documents, come with me." Before she could answer, she felt a firm hand on her arm. The bailiff, Hank Riker, was pulling her hard, leaving no room for questions. Celeste didn't have time to say she was a judge. The way Riker held her arm, like someone holding back from running away, said everything about what he thought of her. The white blouse was now wrinkled, marked by the fingers that had grabbed it roughly. "You can't call me that," she said, not raising her voice, but with a firmness that cut through the hall like a cold blade. Riker ignored it. He looked at another security guard and said, as if following a rehearsed protocol, "Special procedure, room 3. Celeste knew every corner of that courtroom, every room and every face, except that one. Hank Riker was new here, having transferred just a few months ago, and he had probably never paid attention to the portraits of the female judges on the lobby wall. Maybe he had only seen her face as a name on a badge he had never bothered to read. Now he dragged her along as if she were just some suspect, and it was in that silence that Celeste understood. It didn't matter who she was at that moment. The system did not see a female judge. I saw a black woman out of place. Room 3 was cold and windowless. There was a metal stool fixed to the floor and a dingy plastic chair in the corner next to a counter with gloves, scissors, and what looked like a razor. The place smelled of old bleach and neglect. "Take off your earrings, your necklace, and turn your back," Riker ordered. Celeste remained motionless. "Are you going to tell me what's going on?" he asked. He didn't answer. He just put on his gloves. "This is an outrage," she said, her voice now rising. But it was too late. Riker pressed her shoulders against the counter and in a dry gesture shaved off the first lock of hair. The sound of the machine met the silence of the room with a cruelty she would never forget. The scalp, still sensitive, began to burn. But what hurt the most was what that gesture meant. It wasn't just a cut. It was an attempt at erasure, a direct attack on your history, your ancestry, your body as a symbol of authority. And even with the pain, Celeste knew it wouldn't end there. When Riker was finished, he tossed the razor onto the counter as if he had accomplished a mundane task. Celeste silently picked up the necklace that had been forcibly torn off and put it in her bag. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. She just took a deep breath. once, twice, while the image of herself, reflected briefly in the metal of the counter, stood like an open wound in her mind. Hairless, with her scalp exposed and irritated, she found herself as she had never seen herself before, vulnerable in a way that the position of federal judge had never allowed. Riker left the room without saying a word, and in that oppressive void, Celeste stood up with a calm that was not resignation, it was preparedness. She knew that moment would mark the end of something, but also the beginning of something else. A crack had opened, and through there she would let the light in. On her way to the first-floor bathroom, she passed two interns who looked away as soon as they saw her. Celeste went in, locked the door, and washed her face in silence. The cold water ran down her short strands of hair, down her temples, and onto her chin, taking with it some of the dust from the abuse that had just happened. In the mirror, she stared at that version of herself with strangeness and strength. It was as if she had aged years in a few minutes, but there was also something new in her eyes, a kind of clarity that cut through the fear. She dried herself with a paper towel, straightened her blazer, and left the room with steps that were no longer the same. Celeste did not go home. She walked straight to courtroom 1, the main courtroom, where her assistant and the lawyers for the day's case were waiting. It was 8:32 a.m. when she pushed open the wooden double doors. The entire room froze, and then, in a firm voice, she said, "You may take your seats. The trial is about to begin." No one there understood what was happening right away. The shaved hair, the lack of a robe, the direct and unhesitating gaze, all of this seemed to contradict the image of Judge Celeste Monroe that everyone knew. But there was something stronger than the strangeness. There was silence, a heavy, dense silence, the kind that precedes twists and turns. The prosecutor in the case, a young, nervous woman, started to stand up, but Celeste just raised a hand and stopped her with a gesture. She sat behind the bench and arranged the documents in front of her with her usual precision. "Before we begin today's trial, I need to make an official entry in the records. A serious event occurred this morning within this court." The murmur spread like a wave. Celeste took a deep breath. "I was detained, assaulted, and humiliated by an officer of the very institution we swore to serve. My hair was shaved against my will in a restraining room under the pretext of a protocol that does not exist." The prosecutor turned pale. One of the defense attorneys dropped the pen he was holding. The reporter covering the case, sitting in the background, immediately reached for his cell phone. But Celeste didn't hesitate. "I will not reveal any names at this time, as a formal investigation will begin immediately. And yes, I am qualified to judge this case, perhaps more than ever." There was a pause, and then, as if she had rehearsed this moment her entire life, she continued, "This trial concerns a case of police abuse. But what happened to me today is not a coincidence. It is a reflection." The court seemed suspended in air. "And that is precisely why this case will be handled with even greater rigor. Justice, gentlemen, does not submit to fear, and today neither do I." The silence that followed was no longer one of surprise. It was that of reverence. If this story has touched you so far, click the like button. This helps bring this type of content to more people and makes all the difference for those who believe in justice. The trial began with testimony from the family of Malik Sanders, a 19-year-old black man killed during a police stop in Somerville. His father, Ernest, stepped up to the pulpit with shaking hands and an expression that showed a mixture of long pent-up pain and anger. He looked at Celeste with silent respect, as if her presence, there, even marked by violence, was a gesture of resistance in itself. "My son was not a saint, but he was not a public enemy either," he said, his voice hoarse, full of raw emotion. "He was thrown to the ground, choked and handcuffed like an animal, and no one was punished. No one even apologized." Celeste listened to everything without looking away. Each word weighed like a stone, not only because of the content, but because of the feeling that it was all part of a cycle that repeated itself. day after day, within the same walls, where she was now trying to rewrite history. The prosecution presented security camera footage and internal reports that had never been made public before. Celeste had requested full access to the case files weeks earlier, anticipating resistance from the prosecution and internal affairs department. What she found was evidence that had been ignored, notes that had been altered, and at least 2 witnesses who had been omitted from the original investigation. At that moment it became clear there had been more than a procedural error. There had been a cover-up. One of the videos clearly showed the officer involved kneeling on Malik's neck for nearly 5 minutes, even after he had said more than 8 times that he could not breathe. Celeste paused the video before the end, not out of sensitivity, but out of conscious decision. She knew the jurors had seen enough, and she needed them to judge with clarity, not shock. What is on trial here, she said, is not just what is seen in the footage, but what the system has tried to hide from it. During the morning break, the courtroom hallway looked different. There were no whispers, none of the scattered activity typical of trial days. It was as if everyone had understood that they were dealing with something bigger than the case at hand. Celeste did not isolate herself. She refused the room reserved for the judges and preferred to remain in the common area, sitting on one of the padded benches in the hall, with a glass of water in her hand. Her assistant, Thomas, a young lawyer who had been with her for almost 4 years, approached hesitantly. "Do you want me to speak to the press?" he asked. She looked at him and shook her head. "They're going to come anyway. When they do, they'll know exactly what happened. Until then, let's let them see for themselves." Thomas nodded but stood beside her, saying nothing more. It was the kind of silence that respects, not the kind that omits. On her way back to the courtroom, Celeste noticed that one of the witnesses, a police officer named Heather Morales, seemed uneasy. Heather had been called to testify about the defendant's behavior, but from her expression, something was off script. When she took the stand, she confirmed it. After the usual questions, she asked the judge for permission to state something outside the scope of her original testimony. Celeste allowed it. "I want to correct my previous testimony," Heather said, looking her own attorney in the eye. "I was pressured to omit parts of the stop, and I lied about Officer Carl Dugan's conduct." The courtroom froze. The prosecutor tried to interrupt, but Celeste held up her hand again, firm. "Continue, officer." Heather took a deep breath. Malik did not resist arrest. He only asked why he was being detained. Dugan pushed him to the ground without warning, and when I tried to intervene, he threatened me. He said if I opened my mouth, my career would be over. Celeste paused for a long time before answering. "Thank you for your courage. It will not be ignored." Heather's revelation turned the trial upside down. At that moment, the narrative that had been maintained by the defense and part of the prosecution began to crumble piece by piece. Celeste requested a temporary suspension of the session and requested, right then and there, that the Federal Internal Affairs Department be called in to interview the new witness immediately. Thomas hurriedly left to arrange contact with the Internal Conduct Committee. Meanwhile, Celeste remained seated, hands clasped over the documents, staring at the dock. Dugan, the accused officer, was now sweating visibly. He avoided looking in her direction. She knew this type of behavior. She had seen it in courtrooms, in military hearings, and even in political meetings. The fear of being seen for who you really are, when the structure that protected you begins to crumble. By late afternoon, the news had already spread through the hallways. Journalists were crowding the courthouse entrance. Celeste declined interviews, but she allowed a copy of the minutes of the hearing to be sent to the press, uncut, unfiltered. "Let the facts speak for themselves," she told Thomas. When she returned to her office, finally alone, she closed the door carefully and took off her blazer. Her entire body felt heavier than it had that morning. She sat in the leather chair and kicked off her shoes, propping her feet on the thick rug beneath the desk. The silence inside was different, not oppressive, but exhausting. Celeste took a deep breath and put her hand to her shaved head, where the skin still burned. It felt strange, somewhere between vulnerability and rebirth. The very thing they had tried to shame her with was becoming, ironically, her armor. Every torn thread now told a story, and she was only just beginning to write it. The next morning, the courthouse was unrecognizable. Reporters lined the entrance. Protesters held signs with slogans like, "Justice for Malik and we see you, Judge Monroe." Celeste arrived early, as usual, but was greeted with a different kind of silence. It was no longer the silence of estrangement, but of anticipation. Everyone was watching her, not out of curiosity, but of recognition. Without saying a word, she walked up the same stone steps and into the building as if she were stepping into new territory. It was the same courtroom as always, with the same hallways and the same faces, but there was something no one could quite put their finger on. The atmosphere had changed. When Celeste entered the courtroom, the jurors were already in their seats. She sat down, straightened her papers, and looked out into the audience. There were unfamiliar faces there. Some held folders, others held tape recorders, and she knew. This was more than a trial now. It was the epicenter of a transformation. The afternoon brought a new round of testimony, and with it, more revelation. A former prosecutor's office employee, identified only as S, asked to be allowed to testify under protection. He claimed he had been fired after reporting changes to internal reports in the Malik Sanders case. Celeste granted his request and heard him in a closed session, attended only by his lawyers and representatives from the Internal Affairs Department. What he revealed laid bare what had already been suspected. There had been a pattern of evidence manipulation in cases involving officers from Dugan's unit. Autopsy reports were softened, body camera footage disappeared, and civilian witnesses were easily discredited. When Celeste finished listening to the testimony, she closed her eyes for a moment. The weight of the truth had a price, but there in that moment she knew for sure. No matter what came next, she would see it through to the end. The courtroom was no longer a stage for formalities. It was now the arena where she would decide to confront decades of inaction. That night, Celeste couldn't sleep, not because of insomnia, but because there was a lot of living stuff inside her. Images from the day came back in waves, the look in Malik's mother's eyes, Heather Morales' words, the tension in Dugan's shoulders, the silence of the jurors, the crowd outside. She sat at the kitchen table with an untouched chamomile tea, reading and rereading the court notes. But it wasn't just the case that was at stake. It was the entire system. In her email, dozens of messages piled up, colleagues offering support, others questioning her neutrality, and some, in veiled tones, suggesting that she take a leave of absence until the internal investigation was concluded. Celeste read everything carefully, but didn't respond to anyone. She was tired of justifying her presence. By then, I had already learned that for many, a black woman in charge is always an affront, and any reaction that comes from that, a scandal. On the morning of the third day of the trial, Celeste entered the courtroom without her robe, by choice. Her scalp, already showing small scars, was exposed with dignity. It was a symbolic act, but also practical. She didn't want her robe to hide what they had done. She wanted everyone to see it. The courtroom filled up early. Among those present were former colleagues from the bench, lawyers from other states, representatives of civil rights organizations. Thomas approached her before the start and handed her a printed sheet. "This is an open letter, signed by more than 200 legal experts and academics. They are asking you not to back down." She read it silently. At the bottom, a highlighted sentence. "Your courage is a call to action." Celeste took a deep breath, looked at her watch, and simply said, "Let's begin." When she banged the gavel, the sound echoed differently. It had weight, it had history, it had blood, but above all, it had direction. Over the course of that third day, the trial became something Celeste had never experienced before in her career, a kind of collective mirror. Each witness who took the stand seemed to carry a part of the story that had been silenced for years. It was no longer just about Malik. It was about what happened when the system failed to see, or pretended not to see, certain bodies. A retired police officer, Harold Sims, took the stand spontaneously. "I know I wasn't called, Your Honor," he said, standing with his hat in his hand, his voice cracking. "But I worked with Dugan, and what he did to this boy, he's done before. It's just that no one had the courage to tell." A heavy silence fell over the room. Celeste nodded and allowed the testimony. The man went on to tell of 3 similar cases that had been dropped. "I kept quiet, Your Honor, and I regret it every day." The words came out with difficulty, but hung in the air like a slow cut. After that testimony, something broke in the defense. Dugan's attorney began to limit himself to specific objections, visibly uncomfortable with the direction the trial had taken. Celeste, however, did not back down. With each new testimony, she made brief and precise notes, as if constructing a narrative with surgical care. There was no rush, there was no excess, there was method. At the end of that day, she announced that the next steps would involve formally requesting internal records from the Charleston Police Department, and that she would summon representatives from the State Internal Affairs Department to testify if necessary. There was resistance, of course, but her authority was no longer up for debate. It was feared. Celeste knew that this could cost her her job, but she did not hesitate. "If being a judge means keeping my eyes closed to protect the system, then I prefer to be an ex-judge with a clear conscience." On the morning of the 4th day, Celeste was called to a closed-door meeting with 2 representatives of the federal prosecutor's office. They were waiting for her in an adjoining room next to the office of the court's administrative director. Their demeanor was cordial, but it carried the tone of someone about to suggest something for the good. One of them, a middle-aged white man named Ellis Grant, began his speech with measured praise. "The work you've done is admirable, Judge Monroe. We just think it's prudent to consider postponing the trial, given the current context." Celeste crossed her arms. "And what exactly is the problem? The facts, or the repercussions of them?" The other man, a woman with a tense expression and restrained speech, tried to soften the situation. "We're just assessing the institutional risks. This is taking on national proportions." Celeste then leaned forward firmly. "That's precisely why we're not going to stop. The greater risk would be to pretend that nothing is happening." The answer left no room for reply. She stood up, and before leaving the room, said something that would echo for days in the Attorney General's office. "Justice cannot be selective, not even when it is inconvenient." Back in the courtroom, the jurors were already waiting. Celeste resumed driving with the same determination as the previous days, but inside she carried the fatigue of someone who fights on several fronts at the same time. Still, there was a force driving her, and it came not just from indignation, but from something deeper. A non-negotiable conviction that this moment had a purpose. In the middle of the afternoon, a new witness surprised everyone. Dugan's sister. She had contacted the defense asking to be heard. Against her lawyer's advice, she stepped up to the pulpit. With tears in her eyes, she revealed that her brother had always had a history of aggression, including at home, and that for years the family had hidden everything to protect his career. But now it's enough. What he did to that boy was monstrous. "I can't keep quiet any longer." The defense tried to contest the testimony. Celeste denied. "When the truth knocks on the door, it is not up to this court to pretend not to hear." Dugan's sister's testimony had an immediate and devastating effect. For the first time, the defendant lowered his head. His lawyer asked for a 15-minute recess to speak with him in private, which Celeste granted. During the break, the entire court seemed in suspense. The audience murmured softly. Reporters exchanged frantic messages, and even the judges kept their eyes fixed on some point, digesting what they had just heard. Celeste remained seated, motionless, but inside a silent agitation grew. She knew she was facing something rare. The truth was beginning to break through the wall of omission. When the hearing resumed, The defense attorney surprised everyone by stating that Dugan would like to give direct testimony. It was risky, and everyone knew it, but Celeste allowed it. The defendant stood up, walked slowly to the pulpit, and asked for water before beginning. For a moment, it seemed like everything would fall silent to hear what he had to say. Dugan began by denying the charges, but then quickly contradicted himself. He tried to justify his approach, but he stammered. He said that Malik seemed aggressive, but he couldn't describe any real threat. Celeste didn't interrupt him. She let him talk, let him stumble over his words, let him get tangled up in trying to defend the indefensible. At one point he said, "I did what I was trained to do." The sentence fell like a dull blow. One of the jurors, an elderly man, widened his eyes. Celeste then leaned forward slightly and asked in a low but clear voice, "Trained by who, Mr. Dugan?" The defendant hesitated. "By my sergeant, by the seniors." That's what they all did. The room fell silent. Celeste didn't answer right away. She let the sentence hang in the air like thick smoke. Then he wrote something on his clipboard and said, "This will be investigated. We are not just prosecuting an isolated act. We are uncovering a culture." That night, Celeste didn't go straight home. She stopped by Malik's mother, Clarice, who had left a note for her with Thomas, asking for just 5 minutes. Celeste hesitated but went. When she arrived, she found a woman with eyes marked by sleepless nights, but she welcomed her with a firm and silent hug. They sat at the kitchen table, where 2 cups of coffee were already poured, as if Clarice was sure she would come. "I just wanted to look you in the eyes and thank you," her mother said, holding her hand. "You didn't just save my son's memory, you're giving courage to so many people." Celeste, for the first time in days, allowed a tear to fall. She didn't say anything. She stayed there, listening to Clarice tell her about Malik, how he made her sister laugh with bad jokes, how he loved to eat cereal at night, and how he had the habit of leaving hidden notes in her books with phrases like, "It'll be okay, Mom." Before leaving, Clarice gave Celeste one of these notes. It was a little yellowed and folded several times. The handwriting was shaky but clear. "Don't let them erase you." She put the paper inside her folder, among the court documents. On the way back, she drove in silence, her body feeling tired, but her mind awake. That phrase resonated more than any testimony she had heard until then. "Don't let them erase you." When she got home, she placed the note on her desk and stared at it for long minutes. That night, for the first time since the attack, Celeste slept soundly. Sleep came effortlessly, as if her body knew that, at least for a few hours, it was safe. It wasn't relief. It was connection. It was knowing that even in the midst of chaos, there was something that still made sense, and that was worth protecting. The 5th day began with visible tension. The number of people in the courtroom had doubled. There were lines outside, police officers monitoring the entrance, and inside, people were even sitting on the side stairs. The courtroom seemed too small for the scale of the case. Celeste arrived on time, wearing the same navy blue blazer she had worn on the first day, now with the necklace she had recovered that morning, repaired by a local jewelry store. It was a small detail, but it was loaded with meaning. As she took her seat, she noticed that many of those present were not journalists or members of the trial. They were ordinary citizens, people who had never set foot in a courtroom, and they were there for her, for Malik, for the truth. The judge pressed her lips together for a second, then opened the session in a voice as firm as ever. "Today, we will continue to hear witnesses, and at the end, we will decide whether the case will be sent to a federal jury trial." The hubbub died down immediately. The first to testify that day was a young woman named Darlene, a former intern in the department's legal department. She had been called in hastily after contacting Celeste's office by email. At first, she seemed nervous, her voice shaking, but as she recounted what she had seen during the months she had worked alongside the prosecutor in charge of the original case, her voice grew stronger. She said she had seen files being moved around, videos being lost, and that she had heard racist jokes made by the officers on more than one occasion. They called Malik's case Statistics with legs, Your Honor. I have never been able to forget that. The room responded with an indignant murmur. Celeste maintained her composure, but she wrote down every word calmly. "I thank you for your courage, Miss Darlene," she said at the end. "Names like yours write the story that books do not yet have the courage to tell." After Darlene's testimony, Celeste asked for a short break. The heat inside the room was intense, not only because of the number of people, but also because of the electric atmosphere. Outside, the hallway was filled with cameras, microphones, and reporters from national media outlets. Still, Celeste chose to stay inside the room, standing next to the large window that overlooked the square. She watched the movement of the people outside for a few minutes. There was a woman holding a sign that read, "Respect those who serve justice." Celeste felt a tightness in her chest, not from sadness, but from recognition. She knew that feeling of being seen, of being validated by someone who understands, even from a distance, the weight of resistance. Thomas approached with a bottle of water and a restrained expression. "We received a notification from the Ethics Committee. They want to schedule an extraordinary hearing with you after the end of the trial." Celeste took the bottle, drank calmly, and simply replied, "Let them schedule it." The trial resumed with an unexpected twist. The prosecutor in the case, visibly uncomfortable since the first few days, asked to speak. With a tense face and the papers shaking in his hands, he admitted that he had been under direct pressure from superiors to limit the scope of the investigation. "I was instructed not to delve into certain points. I was informed that my career would depend on my discretion." The silence that fell after this sentence was one of the heaviest of the entire trial. Celeste did not hide her astonishment, but she did not interrupt either. She waited for him to finish. "I am available to collaborate with any additional investigation that this court orders," concluded the prosecutor. Celeste paused, looked at the jurors, and then turned back to him. "Your omission has caused irreparable harm, Mr. Waller, but your choice to speak today will be recorded. And yes, there will be an investigation. Everyone who participated in this scheme will be held accountable. Justice may have been delayed, but it is now standing." That afternoon, the jury was temporarily dismissed while Celeste gathered the information needed to formalize the requests to the Inspectorate and the Ministry of Justice. The court had ceased to be just a place of trial and had become an epicenter of denunciation, rupture, and reconstruction. Each testimony presented was a shard of a corroded system, and Celeste knew that it was not enough to convict one man. She needed to illuminate the entire web. While organizing the documents, she received a handwritten note discreetly handed to her by a cleaning lady, a soft-spoken lady who had been discreetly cleaning the back of the courtroom since the beginning of the trial. The note read, "Thank you. I saw everything. I just never had the voice to say it." It was more than a message. It was a silent confession of how many eyes had been silenced over the years, and now they were beginning to break through fear. At the end of the day, Celeste called a press conference, not to defend herself or to promote her work, but to ensure that no part of the process was distorted by speculation. The room reserved for the press conference was packed. There were representatives from foreign media outlets, public defenders, civil rights organizations, and curious onlookers. Dressed simply, without makeup or adornments, she spoke with the same firmness as always. "I was attacked within the very institution I served for more than 20 years. This will not be ignored, but the focus is not on me. The focus is on what this trial has revealed, a system that protects itself in silence and punishes those who dare to expose the truth." There were questions, some incisive, others provocative. When a journalist questioned her impartiality, she responded precisely, "Impartiality is not ignoring injustice. It is treating everyone with the same rigor, including those who wear uniforms or carry gold badges." The applause that followed was not formal. It was the sound of an audience that, for the first time in a long time, believed what they were hearing. On the morning of the 6th day, the courthouse was surrounded by a barrier of federal security, guards, The press, which had previously been concentrated on the sidewalks, now occupied part of the street, and live broadcasts had become constant. Celeste arrived unescorted. She declined the offer of extra protection, as she had done since the first day. "If I start walking around scared, they'll win," she told Thomas, who no longer tried to dissuade her. When she passed through the main entrance, the guards discreetly moved away, and she walked silently to the courtroom. Inside, the jurors were ready, the lawyers were focused, and the audience was silent. It was the day that the testimony was to close, and everyone knew that something important would soon be decided. Celeste, in a calm voice, announced, "Today we will hear the closing arguments, and at the end I will issue my decision as to whether this case will continue to a higher court." The closing arguments were intense. The prosecution, now represented by a deputy prosecutor, presented the case consistently, reinforcing the pattern of abuse and the systematic cover-up of evidence. The defense tried to rescue the argument of police protocol and the tense context of the approach, but the rhetoric seemed empty in the face of so much testimony, videos, and contradictions. Celeste listened attentively, without interrupting once. She took notes, observed the jurors' reactions, and maintained the imperturbable posture that had come to symbolize her conduct. When the parties finished, she paused before speaking. She took a deep breath. This trial revealed more than a flaw. It revealed a pattern. It showed that silence, when institutionalized, becomes complicit. The entire courtroom held its breath. "In light of everything that has been presented, I order that this case be forwarded to the federal court with a jury trial, and I also recommend that an investigation be opened to investigate the conduct of all public officials directly or indirectly involved in this case." The decision hit the news like a bombshell. In less than an hour, TV channels, radio stations, and news portals were already running headlines like, "Judge Celeste Monroe refers police abuse case to federal court," and "Justice gets a new name, Monroe." But inside the courthouse, what drew the most attention was not the spotlight. It was the silent transformation of the people. Court employees began to greet Celeste with visible respect, some even with emotion in their eyes. Fellow judges, who until then had been watching from a distance, began to speak out, sending messages of support and recognition. But Celeste knew that the counterattack was yet to come. She knew that publicly challenging the system would have a high price. Still, there was one thing that could no longer be taken away from her: control of the narrative. For the first time, she was not just a cog. She was the hand that turned the key. The next day, Celeste was summoned by the Judicial Ethics Committee. She was not surprised. She dressed as soberly as ever, tied her hair, which was already beginning to grow, into small strands close to her scalp, and went to the annex building of the federal court. There, she was received by a panel of 4 members, 2 of whom were former classmates at the School of the Judiciary. The session was formal, but fraught with hidden tension. "Do you understand that by exposing yourself publicly, you may have compromised your impartiality?" asked one of the counselors in a cold tone. Celeste answered without hesitation, "What compromises justice is not transparency, it is silence in the face of error." There was a discreet murmur among those present. One of the members, a younger one, asked another question. "Do you have anything to say before the final opinion?" Celeste then said, "I do, and I want it recorded in the minutes. I do not regret anything, and I would do it all over again, even knowing the consequences." 2 days after the Ethics Committee session, Celeste received an official letter informing her that despite her conduct outside the expected standard, there would be no sanctions against her actions. The decision caused a stir within the legal community, but was received enthusiastically by civil society. The repercussions of the Malik Sanders case had already gone beyond the court's borders. Universities organized debates, NGOs released statements of support, and social movements used excerpts from the hearings in social media campaigns. The image of Celeste, with her scalp still visibly marked, and her serene expression had become a symbol of integrity. A portrait of her made by a street artist in Charleston began to circulate as an icon of resistance. But for Celeste, everything was still very personal. She continued to go to the courthouse every day, maintaining the same routine, the same posture. She did not want to become a martyr. She wanted justice. It was during this period that she received the most unexpected invitation, a letter from the presidential office inviting her to a meeting in Washington with the National Council of Justice. At first, he thought it was a misunderstanding or a political smokescreen, but after confirming the authenticity of the invitation, he decided to go. Once there, she was received with formality and admiration, even by those who had previously seen her as a radical. During the meeting, he presented an outline of what would come to be known as the Monroe Mandate, a set of guidelines that proposed zero-tolerance measures for discrimination in the federal courts. It included everything from mandatory training on racial bias to the creation of independent ombudsman offices in each state. At the end of the meeting, she was surprised by the announcement. The president would sign the proposal as an emergency provisional measure. Celeste, for the first time in weeks, was speechless, not out of vanity, but because there he felt that what started as pain was becoming public policy. The signing of the Monroe Mandate triggered a series of structural changes. Courts in different states began to review their protocols, and hundreds of archived complaints were once again analyzed in light of the new guidelines. Celeste's name began to be mentioned in seminars, panels, and editorials as a synonym for institutional courage. But despite her growing recognition, she remained down to earth. She continued to handle minor cases, analyze petitions, and treat all cases with the same rigor, whether they had national repercussions or not. Justice cannot be selective in scandals or in details, she would tell her colleagues. And so she continued, driving home in the same silver Buick, drinking the same bitter coffee every morning, and always arriving at court ahead of schedule. What changed the world began with a choice: not to keep quiet. Shortly thereafter, Celeste was invited to speak at an international conference on racial justice in The Hague. The invitation surprised her and made her a little uncomfortable. She had never imagined herself as a global figurehead, but encouraged by Thomas and Clarice herself, she decided to accept. On the night of the event, in front of a packed auditorium, she spoke for 20 minutes without reading a single line. She recounted the events of that September in Charleston with clarity, emotion, and conviction. When she finished, there was a long silence, followed by a standing ovation. After her speech, a young law student from Nigeria approached her and said, "You made me believe that being a judge can be more than applying the law. It can be about finally making it work." Celeste smiled and thanked her. Back at the hotel, it took her a while to fall asleep, not because she was anxious, but because she relived every step that had led her to that point. She knew that not everything was resolved, but for the first time, she believed that it was possible to start over for many people. Upon returning from The Hague, Celeste found her desk covered in letters. Some came from fellow judges, others from mothers like Clarice, thanking her for the courage and dignity with which she had faced everything. But the one that touched her most was a handwritten letter from a 16-year-old girl from the Bronx. "My name is Alana, and I want to be a judge like you. Before, I thought this place wasn't made for people like me. Now I know it is." Celeste read the letter slowly, twice. Then she lovingly stored it in a box she kept on the shelf next to her oldest files. It wasn't vanity, it was memory, a constant reminder that every act, even the ones that seemed small or routine, could reach someone she would never meet, but who, in some way, was already walking with her. Meanwhile, Malik Sanders's case was moving forward in federal court. Jury selection was televised, media coverage intensified, and pressure on the prosecutor's office and local police increased by the day. Celeste, for legal reasons, could no longer directly judge the case. It was now being handled by a colleague from another state, but her role in the initial proceedings had become a reference. When asked how she felt about seeing the case move forward without her, she replied, "Justice doesn't need me to be there. It needs my work." And that work continued. She helped implement the Monroe Mandate in several states, provided technical support to younger judges, and held monthly meetings with study groups on judicial ethics. There was no rest, but there was meaning. Celeste never sought recognition. She sought fixes, and even if she didn't fix everything, she knew she had made a difference where many would not dare touch. Dugan's trial ended with a conviction for manslaughter and falsification of evidence. It wasn't the harshest sentence possible, but it was enough to set legal precedents and reverse the historical trend of acquittals in similar cases. On the day of the verdict, Celeste watched the reading on TV in her office. When she heard the result, she didn't celebrate or get visibly emotional. She just closed her eyes for a few seconds and said in a low voice, "Now, no one can say they didn't know." For her, that moment didn't represent victory, but rather minimal justice. She knew that there were dozens, perhaps hundreds of other cases that would never get to this point, but she also knew that something had changed, and that, even without a happy ending, the truth had been told, loudly, clearly, and in front of everyone. A few days later, Celeste received a call from the president's office. She was informed that she would receive the Presidential Medal of Justice, the highest honor granted to a judicial officer. Initially, she hesitated to accept, not out of false modesty, but because she feared that the gesture would be used to soften the image of a government that had done little up until then. After thinking it over, she decided to go. "I accept it not for myself, but for the people who couldn't get here," she said. At the ceremony held in Washington before an audience full of leaders, activists, and representatives of international justice, Celeste took the stage wearing the same navy blue blazer she had worn on the first day, now revamped with a small brooch in the shape of a scale, a gift from Clarice. Upon receiving the medal, she gave a brief, direct speech. "I'm not perfect, but in that courtroom, even when I was injured, I didn't lower my head, and that's why I'm here." The entire audience stood up, not for the medal, but for everything it symbolized. After the ceremony in Washington, Celeste returned to Charleston with a feeling she couldn't quite name. It wasn't exactly pride, nor relief. It was somewhere between tiredness and peace. In the taxi that took her from the airport to her house, she looked out the window at the streets she knew by heart, the old buildings, the discreet cafes, the gas station where she used to fill up every Monday. Everything seemed the same, but she knew it had changed. When she arrived at her building, she was greeted with a note at the front desk. It was from Thomas. "I'll be back tomorrow. Rest, and don't forget, the world has seen you." She smiled to herself, climbed the stairs, as she always did, avoiding the elevator, and entered her house with the feeling that, even with all her wounds, she was exactly where she needed to be. She took off her shoes, put the kettle on, and let the silence fill the room. For the first time in a long time, that silence wasn't oppressive. It was just silence. The next morning, when he arrived at the courthouse, he noticed that something had changed on the entrance mural. Where there had once been only old, sepia-toned portraits of white men in dark suits, there was now a space reserved for them with a new frame, and inside it, a recent photograph. It was Celeste. No wig, no filter, steady eyes looking straight into the camera. The plaque below read, "Judge Celeste Monroe, integrity in times of disruption." She paused for a few seconds in front of the image, not because of the vanity of seeing oneself there, but because of the awareness of what it represented. It wasn't just her in that photo. It was also Malik, Clarice, Heather, Darlene, Alana, and so many other names that would never be on a mural, but that were part of it all. Upon entering the room, the employees stood up in a spontaneous gesture of respect. Celeste just nodded and said, as she did every day, "Good morning. Let's get to work." As the months passed, the Monroe Mandate became established as a national policy. Monitoring reports began to show a significant drop in cases of judicial misconduct and an increase in the transparency of the proceedings. State courts began to adopt adaptations of the program, and Celeste's name became an ethical reference for a new generation of jurists. In Charleston, she continued her routine almost intact. She turned down invitations to run for political office and proposals from publishers interested in publishing her biography. "I'm not interested in becoming a character. I'm busy being useful," she would say in the matter-of-fact tone she never abandoned. Sometimes she would walk to the courthouse just to breathe in the city calmly. She still received looks, some of admiration, others of judgment, but none of them disconcerted her anymore. Her center was firm, and little by little, Celeste began to laugh more easily, sleep better, and even take care of the plants she had let die during the trial. On a typical September afternoon, exactly 1 year after the attack, she sat on her porch with a notebook on her lap. She began to write, not with the intention of publishing, but of understanding what still lived inside her. She wrote about the moment she entered the containment room, about the sound of the hair shaver, about the sensation of cold water running down her scalp. She spared nothing. She wanted to remember, not to hurt herself again, but to acknowledge the journey. After a few pages, she stopped and looked out at the street. A group of students walked by, laughing loudly, wearing t-shirts that read, "Justice is a verb." Celeste smiled. She folded the page carefully and placed it inside the book she was reading, a forgotten novel about women who resist in silence. She no longer needed to prove anything, but she wanted to make sure that if someone ever read those words, they would know that justice also bleeds, and yet it walks. Take this moment to comment below what has touched you the most so far. Your opinion is part of the conversation, and it can inspire others too. One sunny Saturday, Celeste decided to visit Clarice. She brought an apple pie she had made herself and a small plant as a gift. When she arrived, she was greeted with the same firm hug as always, as if no time had passed. They sat on the porch, where the wind blew gently, and the smell of fresh coffee mingled with the flowers in the garden. They talked about everything except the trial. It was as if they both knew that some things don't need to be said again. They just need to be felt. At one point, Clarice held Celeste's hand and said, "Do you know what impressed me about you? It wasn't your strength, it was your care. You didn't shout or scream, but you didn't lower your head either. That's what I call faith with a spine." Celeste smiled, taking her time to answer. She looked at the sky, where a few clouds danced slowly, and thought that perhaps this was the closest she had ever felt to redemption. Before leaving, Clarice handed her a small envelope. Inside was a photo of Malik as a child, sitting on a concrete staircase, smiling with a missing tooth and a scraped knee. On the back, written in blue pen, a short phrase, "Always standing." Celeste held the photo carefully, as if it were glass. He thanked her silently and put it in his bag, among his work papers. On the way back, the radio played an old song that she used to listen to with her father when she was still a teenager. For a moment he wanted to sing along, and he did. Short, getting the lyrics wrong in the middle, but with a light chest. The city looked the same, but she was no longer the same woman who had once walked through those courthouse corridors unrecognized, and maybe never would again, because now she knew it wasn't the robe that made the judge. It was the courage to keep standing, even when they tried to take everything away from you. Saham. The following months, Celeste began to be invited to meetings with law students across the country. He always accepted on the same condition: no platforms, ready-made speeches, or excessive formalities. "I wanted to sit in a circle, talk closely, listen." On one such visit to a college campus in Alabama, a student asked, "What would you say to someone who wants to be a judge but is afraid of not being respected because of the color of their skin or where they come from?" Celeste responded with the calm of someone who has carried this fear on her shoulders for years. "I would tell you to remember that the respect that really matters is the one you have for yourself. The rest we face and change. The room fell silent, but not out of embarrassment, in reverence. That night, she returned to the hotel and wrote this sentence on a paper napkin. I didn't know whether to remember or to leave a trace, but I felt that it shouldn't be lost. One afternoon, while reviewing a trivial traffic case at the courthouse, she was approached by a young clerk from the registry office. She was shaking slightly as she held an envelope. Sorry to interrupt, doctor. It's just that this is my request for dismissal. But before I leave, I needed to tell you that it was because of you that I got here. I thought this place wasn't for me. And today I'm leaving to study to become a public defender. Celeste stood up and hugged her without saying anything. Then she handed her a book with the bookmark still. Inside, the one where she had kept the page with the handwritten letter. Keep this. When it's your turn, you'll know what to do. The girl left crying. Celeste returned to her chair, looked at the case about the parking violation, and laughed to herself. Life sometimes chooses the most unexpected moments to show that the fight was worth it. Over time, the physical scars faded. Her scalp already displayed short, dense curls, and Celeste decided not to straighten them or hide them. That's how he grows, and that's how I continue, he would say when asked. A simple gesture, but one that carried symbolic weight. It was his way of keeping the memory of what happened alive without having to relive the pain every day. She continued working as always, but now there was something different in her eyes. It wasn't bitterness nor arrogance. It was a kind of powerful calm, like someone who knows exactly where they are stepping. The younger ones sought her advice, the older ones respected her in silence, and even the harshest critics had learned to measure their words when speaking her name. Celeste never asked for this. He simply did what he believed was right, and because of that, he came to represent what many were still afraid to face. One Friday night, as she was closing her office, Thomas appeared at the door with a restrained expression. There's someone waiting in the lobby. He said he won't leave until he speaks to you. Celeste sighed, thinking it was just another journalist, but she went over to him. She found a middle-aged man dressed simply and with deep-set eyes. It was Malik's father. I'm sorry to show up like this without warning. I just wanted to see you, to look you in the eyes and say, thank you. Because after all, you were the only person who saw my son for who he was, as a boy, not as a threat. Celeste didn't know what to say. She reached out her hand, but he pulled her into a restrained, strong, and brief hug. When he pulled away, he smiled. Now I can sleep in peace, not because it's over, but because someone did what had to be done. When he left, Celeste stood there for a while, staring at the door. Sometimes justice doesn't come with a sentence. It comes with silence, with presence, with truth. That night, lying in bed with the window open, Celeste listened to the sounds of the city. Cars passing in the distance, a dog barking, someone laughing on the sidewalk. It was a familiar sound, but it seemed new, as if, after all that, the city had changed along with her. She got up, went to her desk, and opened the drawer where she kept her most important notes. She took out the one from Malik, "Don't let them erase you," and read it quietly. That sentence followed her like a compass. No matter how many speeches she gave, how many projects she coordinated, or how many invitations she received, that was the center of everything, the root. She folded the note with the same care as always and put it back. Then she closed the window, turned off the light, and lay down. Sleep came quickly, deeply, and in that moment of surrender, Celeste understood. Justice was not a destiny. It was a choice that was renewed, day after day. The following week, during a lecture at a local university, she was asked if she had ever forgiven the man who shaved her head. There was a brief silence in the room. Celeste crossed her legs, looked at the audience, and answered sincerely, "I don't know if forgiveness is the right word, but I've stopped carrying him around with me." Her answer was met with a kind of understanding that needed no applause. After the event, a woman approached her and said, "My granddaughter talks about you like your family. She wants to be a judge." Celeste smiled. "Then tell her she already is." All that's left is for the world to understand. When she returned home, she sat on the porch with a cup of tea and a blanket around her shoulders. The night was cold, but peaceful. The kind of peace that can't be bought or asked for. It can only be built. And there, in that silence, she knew that everything, absolutely everything, was worth it. Over time, Celeste began to be invited not only as a judge, but also as a reference in institutional reconstruction processes. She was invited to participate in international commissions, collaborate on judicial reforms in Latin American and African countries, and even to join a UN panel on restorative justice. But she always made it clear, I accept, as long as I can continue to judge my cases in Charleston. She never wanted to leave her roots, not out of romanticism, but because she knew that it is in the details of everyday life that justice is sustained. It was in small hearings, in neighborhood disputes, in requests for custody and alimony, that she kept alive what really mattered: listening, respect, and the humane application of the law. And even though the world saw her as a symbol, she never forgot that she was, above all, a public servant. One late afternoon, as the courthouse closed, Celeste stopped for a moment at the main door. She observed the empty lobby, the chairs lined up, the smell of wood and paper. She remembered the first time she had set foot there, still young, full of doubts, believing that she would have to conform to everything in order to be accepted. And now, decades later, she realized that it was precisely by refusing to conform that she had left her mark. She picked up her bag, turned off the lights, and left, crossing the same stone steps she had once been dragged down. But now each step was her own. When she reached the sidewalk, she looked up and saw the sky tinged with orange and lilac. She took a deep breath. There was no audience. There was no applause. Only the sound of her own footsteps echoing firmly on the ground. And there, alone but whole, she knew, there is no greater justice than being able to move forward without having betrayed oneself. On the anniversaries of the trial, Celeste always took the day for herself. I turned off my cell phone, didn't answer emails, and walked to the garden of a small church in the city center, where there was a stone bench under an ancient tree. I would sit there for hours, reading or just watching people come and go. Sometimes someone recognized her but respected the silence. It was the only ritual she kept strictly. It wasn't mourning, it was memory. A reminder that what started as a public humiliation turned into one of the most powerful moments of your life. And even with the scars left, she never wished it had been different, because it was exactly there, in the pain, in the astonishment, in the swallowed scream, and in the imposed silence, that she discovered what it really meant to do justice, not as a profession, but out of conviction. One afternoon, as she was getting up from the bench to leave, a young woman approached slowly. She had braided hair, a backpack on her back, and a firm gaze. "Judge Monroe?" she asked. Celeste nodded with a small smile. "I just wanted to say that you changed the ending of my story. I was going to drop out of law school, but after what happened, I decided to stay." Celeste held the young woman's gaze for a moment and replied, "Then now, it's your turn to change other stories." She walked to the street without looking back, listening to her own footsteps with the serenity of someone who knows she has planted something that will continue to grow, even when she is no longer there to see it. Because in the end, it wasn't about her. It was about everyone who came before and everyone who would come after. Years later, in an interview for a documentary about the impact of the Monroe Mandate, Celeste was asked if she thought she had really changed the system. She thought for a few seconds before answering. "I don't think I broke the system, but I made him look in the mirror, and for a few moments he saw himself as he really is." Her answer became one of the most reproduced lines in the film, but for her, it was simply the truth. Celeste knew that the work was ongoing, tireless, and that there would always be setbacks. But she also knew that something fundamental had been initiated. Silence was no longer guaranteed. Victims were no longer alone, and the courts, once shielded by indifference, now had voices echoing off the walls. She continued to judge cases, mentor young jurists, and maintain the firmness that made her a symbol, but she never let them turn her into a statue. She was alive, present, in movement. Today, Celeste Monroe still walks the same halls of the courthouse where it all began. His steps are firm but calm. His hair has grown, his blue blazer is showing signs of age, and his name has started to be mentioned in books and law classes throughout the country. But when asked about everything she experienced, she usually answers simply, "I just did my job. Only this time, I did it in a way that I couldn't pretend they didn't see it anymore." And that's why his story continues to be told, because more than a judge, Celeste became a mirror. One of those that don't distort, that don't soften, that don't divert. A mirror where justice finally was forced to face itself. And there, reflected in the courage of an ordinary woman, she finally began to change. If this story deserves to be remembered, turn on notifications and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Justice also begins with those who spread what matters.